education monitoring report. Thank you so much for joining us on France 24 today. Climate change is a very vast issue. There's the science behind it, but also the social implications. Can you maybe just start by clarifying what we're talking about when we talk about climate change education?
Well, you just mentioned educating the new generation, but let's not forget, until the new generation reaches adulthood and can take the actions that we need, it might be over. So climate change education and communication is really for all, is for all generations, because we cannot wait. The action needs to be taken now. The challenge is that, as you suggested, introducing the science in our national education programs has not proven to be enough. Of course, it is a necessary condition, but it does not yet seem to lead to changes in attitudes and especially behaviors that are really critical for sustainable, especially consumption.
Okay, so when we're talking about climate education, we're mostly talking about the science of it. Can you tell us more about some of the highlights of your study? Were there any countries in particular that maybe stood out as having progress to be made?
I think what is really important to note is that countries, including France, for instance, are realizing that just the science is not enough. First of all, we see that even in countries that do teach the science, results are very variable, and there are so many young people who actually cannot understand even today the basics. So what is gradually happening is two things. First, countries are realizing that the education programs need to focus not just on science, but also on talking about climate change and the actions that are required in other subjects, even in social science, even in language. Ultimately, what is needed is a change in the way we understand our responsibility to the others. The civic education, for instance, is critical to cover climate change education. But there is also a second aspect to the changes that need to happen. This is about educating young people not just in the theory, but in the practice. And that involves social and emotional learning on the one hand, understanding the consequences, because many young people, we should not forget, feel anxiety. They feel maybe there's nothing to be done. And that is really not a very good starting point. We need to educate young people to understand that action can happen now, can be radical, can be rapid. But ultimately, we also need to have pedagogies that prompt young people and adults into action. It's not just about reading about the climate change phenomena from the books. Young people need to be out in the countryside. They need to invest themselves in projects to the extent possible, of course. And that is a big challenge for education systems today.
One of the big issues, as I mentioned at the COP28, is resistance from oil-producing nations to cut fossil fuels. Is it also important for economic and political structures surrounding climate change to be included in that education?
Well, exactly. That actually directly responds to my point. We need to do so many things. Education reflects society, and if society has certain values and principles that make people think in individual terms and not really in the social and planetary implications of their actions, how are we expected to see change? And that affects also teachers. Teachers also represent society, and they need to be supported more than anyone else to make transitions to such critical new ways of teaching young people. I think France is trying that very hard. There are very interesting resources available for teachers and for learners. EduSchool is one example, Réseau Canopé is another example, and I think countries increasingly recognize the need to support teachers.
Does the United Nations have any sort of plan to push for a global standard when it comes to the type of education you'd like to see?
Well, education, unfortunately, if only that were as simple as that, is not really easy to standardize. Every country understands, of course, the threat of climate change in a different way and understands the needs of children in different ways. But there is definitely a mobilization at the UN level. You may have heard that there was a major education summit, the Transforming Education Summit, convened last year by the UN Secretary General, precisely to issue a call for action to countries to think in those terms. And there was a new partnership, the Greening Education Partnership, that UNESCO has organized, that is bringing all these different ideas into a common framework for action. And that includes, among other things, also greening schools, making schools the places that are not just a place for learning through the books, but through the engagement of the community, through the restructuring of the buildings. And we know so well how much we need to invest in buildings to be greener. Let's not also forget how much they contribute to emissions and how much we need to do. And I know France also has a major program now rolling out to all 60,000 schools and universities to improve their infrastructure.
Do you expect, or have you already experienced any pushback from countries when it comes to climate education?
No, really, I think it is one of those issues that unites countries. It is true there are some countries where climate change is becoming politicized, and people sometimes lose the arguments there in terms of the scientific explanations. There are doubters. But in terms of education systems per se, I think we can say that there is a mobilization around the world to improve curricula. The problem is such changes usually, so far, have been taking place very, very slowly. And now that is a big question, how education systems can make a rapid change to bring also the change in behavior that we so desperately need.
All right, Manos Antoninis, thank you so much again for joining us here today on France 24. That's Manos Antoninis, the director of the Global Education Monitoring Report that just released statistics about climate change education. Well, for the next 3 days, Egyptians are